Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. I love that. This issue of integrity, that there was no corruption that they could find in Daniel. Oftentimes we relate corruption with politics. And we understand because the word politics comes from the word poly, meaning many, and ticks, meaning blood-sucking creatures. And so in politics, we recognize that there's a lot of corruption that is invested there, but also we recognize that there's sometimes corruption or dishonesty in our own lives. There was a associate pastor who invited his mother over for Thanksgiving dinner to share with his girlfriend and himself so that she could get to know him. As she decided that she would help out by cooking for them and use a skillet that he liked to have. At the end of their dinner, they began to talk about just their relationship with one another, and the mother was happy to hear the report of our son being faithful in this relationship with his girlfriend. As she left out, 2 weeks had passed, and the son called his mom and said, "Hey, Mom, I can't seem to find our skillet anywhere. We really want to, I just want to make some more meals again because time is coming towards, Christmas, and I want to really do something special for my girlfriend." And so his mother said, "Son, I don't have your skillet. I really put it where you can find it." And so he went around and said, "Mom, I looked throughout the house, and I can't find it anywhere." And she said, "Son, I'm very disappointed in you that you lied to me about your relationship with your girlfriend." He said, I thought you weren't sleeping with her." He said, "Mom, I'm not sleeping with my girlfriend." She said, "Well, if you weren't sleeping with your girlfriend, you would have found your skillet because it was on your bed all this time." It's important for you and I to understand when it comes to the area of integrity and honesty, that Daniel was found with no corruption at all, but competence instead. Look what he says, that not only was he without corruption, but the fun thing about it, that he was trustworthy and he wasn't negligent. In other words, he was able to do his job well. Competence, the ability to do one's job well. Listen, oftentimes, particularly among believers, when it comes to the area of leadership, that you are a leader in the classroom. You are a leader wherever you go. That you must understand that God has put you, positioned you in a place where you must display competence. I'm not saying that everything that you do will have an A attached to it, but no one will ever accuse you of not being able to do your best. That what you did very well. See, Jesus, what the teachers need to see, particularly as Pastor Walker helped me to understand here in Toronto, that is very humanistic in this particular city. Therefore, you must display what Jesus looks like when you're in the classroom, what Jesus looked like when you're on a job. That they have to see what Jesus looks like as a student, what Jesus looked like when he's an administrative assistant, what Jesus looked like when he's going around and he's working in a local store. You must be able to display with competence, giving your very best. And people identifying that because they are believers, we want to hire them, not because we agree with their theology, but we love their work ethic. That's right. Number 5, consecration. That Daniel not only demonstrated character, conduct, no corruption, but integrity and competence, but consecration. His communication and communion with God. Look at verse 10 and 11. It says, "Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows were open towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he had done before." If you're going to really be a leader that follows after the heart of God, you got to know the heart of God. The scary thing about Christianity, particularly those of us who are even in ministry, is that oftentimes we will substitute the work of God for an intimate relationship with Him. And the two are not the same. See, I can prepare myself for a Bible study to teach you without having Bible study myself to be in communion with God, myself. We oftentimes can substitute our acts of ministry for intimacy. If you really want to know the heart of God, you got to be close enough to it. You got to be able to learn how to communicate with him. So here's a question for you. How often do you communicate with God? And are your prayers designed to adore him or to beg him? When you go before God, does he often hear gimme prayers? Or does he hear from you about the intimacy of wanting to know him and acknowledging him for who he is? Are there prayers of intimacy? Or are there always prayers of asking him to do something for you? Daniel was in communion with the Lord. He had to hear what was on God's heart so he can serve him. Because the worst thing to do is to serve God in a manner, in a way that he hasn't called you to serve him. And that's why we have a whole lot of Christians out there who are always burned out and say that they're tired, because oftentimes they may be doing the work of the ministry that God has not called them to. It's about communion. Being able to hear the heart of God so I can respond to him. Daniel was in communion. But there's a consequence. Pastor Coleman said, being a leader can be difficult. Being a leader, let me add to that, can cost you your life. Standing before and representing God can cost you your life. Notice with me in verse 16 and 17 as we come to a close in this segment. Verse 16 says, so the king gave the order. And just to put it in context, in order for them to be able to accuse Daniel, they had to come up with an edict, an order, a law that had been established and signed and sealed by the king, that they ought to acknowledge the king and the king alone as the king of this kingdom and no other God. And so they outlawed prayer to any other God. And they accused Daniel because they caught him praying before the living God. And so the penalty of that was that he was to be thrown into a den full of lions. I'm not talking kittens. We're talking lions. Verse 16, so the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that the Daniel's situation might not be changed. In other words, if the king places his seal there, it means do not disturb or do not enter. Once the king had placed his signet upon something, it means that you no longer had access to it, unless it was by order of the king himself. The king had Daniel thrown into a den filled with lions because Daniel was praying against the law of the culture. See, oftentimes, not only are you called to submit to authority, but whenever the authorities compel you to deny your God, you must not submit to that authority, but only the authority by which God has surrendered. And there was a consequence. If you're going to be serious about this leadership thing, it may cost you friends. If you're going to be serious about leadership, you're going to have to recognize that you can't be in the crowd of everybody else. You're going to have to be very distinctive. You're going to have to be able to go right when everybody else is going left. Even for the young people that are sitting here, let me just say this to you as we talk about it often among ourselves. That means that you protect your own virginity. That you don't do what this sexually saturated culture compels us to do. That you recognize that this thing costs me. There might be some consequence, but I must obey the living God because I recognize that he knows me. He's intimately involved with me, and he has greater gifts than he would give to me. Do you recognize that God's will is good, is perfect, and is pleasing? So here's a question for you. What can you add to perfect to make it better? Nothing, right? So why would you not want his will? And for him, Daniel, there was a consequence. He was thrown into a lion's den. I'm not sure what den that you may ever face, but I can guarantee you there may be a den that you shall face in the area of leadership when it comes to standing and representing Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior in your life as you live and breathe and model for him. Daniel recognized that there was a consequence, there was a cost. But then notice the compliment in his leadership, verse 18. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. Verse 19, at the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near to the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, and he said, Daniel, servant of the living God, your God whom you serve continually, have been able to rescue you from the lion's den. And Daniel responded, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I done any wrong before you, O king. Get this. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found from him, because he has trusted in his God. They didn't even scratch him. I don't know what maybe you're familiar with lions and people walking around lions all the time. But these were lions. And they had these lions hungry. So that when Daniel showed up and was thrown in these, it would be a lion's nature to attack and to tear him apart. But there was not even a scratch on him. How do we know how serious this was? Let's continue reading. Verse 24, at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den. Now, not only was the men, because a man was always ahead of his household. So get this. Not only were the men thrown in the lion's den, but also their wives and their children. And before they even reached, how hungry were the lions? Before they even reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. And here's Daniel's compliment. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language throughout the land, may you prosper greatly, for I issue a decree that in every part of the kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of King Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. The compliment of one in leadership. John MacArthur says this in closing. According to Scripture, virtually everything that truly qualifies a person for leadership is directly related to character. It's not about style or status or personal charisma or clout or worldly measurements of success. Integrity is the main issue that makes a difference between a good leader and a bad one. The way leadership is always going to be demonstrated and exemplified by God himself is when he opens you up to see what's inside of you. Or as we say at High Ground, when you squeeze, what's inside of you is what comes out. That's the nature and the qualities of leadership from the heart and perspective of Daniel.